Christopher Dahl was no stranger to the radio industry. The Harvard Business School graduate got his start in 1986 when he created a broadcast group made up of 19 radio stations in the Midwest and Hawaii called Community Airwaves. After a few years of learning the ins and outs of the world of radio, Dahl had an idea. See, there was no shortage of specialty radio. Were you into sports, country music, talk, oldies? Whatever your cup of tea was, there was likely a radio station out there to tune into. Yet, up until that point, children's programming for radio was more or less an afterthought. Some stations across the country offered small blocks of children's entertainment, but that was about it. Dahl saw a gap in the market. So in 1990, Dahl rolled the dice and created the Children's Broadcasting Corporation. And with it, he set out to prove that a dedicated children's radio network was a viable business idea. He would be proven right, and yet, it would cost him everything.
There's one radio station in America where an oldie might be defined as anything recorded before 1990, and that is because the oldest member of the management team is only 14 years old. Watch this.
In 1992, the Children's Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, formally launched Radio AAHS, the first national network that was exclusively dedicated to radio programming for children under the age of 12. Their flagship station, WWTC-AM in Minneapolis, featured everything from music to news to live shows. The airwaves were populated with a blend of children's music as well as family-friendly pop music. A listener might hear a duet by Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy one minute, only for it to be followed by Boyz II Men's Thank You the next. Short news segments aired 7 times each weekday and 4 times on the weekends, and aimed to present real current events in a way that children could understand. DJs, sometimes children themselves, would run trivia contests focused on education rather than pop culture throughout the day for small prizes. When Radio AAHS was introduced to the world, it wasn't a national phenomenon. It didn't blow everybody away. However, from a content perspective, it was considered fairly successful. Kids and their parents were tuning in, and it looked like there was a future for CBC to grow.
What does Radio AAHS mean? AAHS, right?
Well, I kind of thought, I never really heard, but I always thought maybe it meant like a sigh, like finally. Finally we have kids radio. Right.
However, financially, things were a different story. The CBC went public that very same year, but there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding the business model of the network. Radio, as an industry, was mostly supported by advertising revenue. The common belief at the time was that targeting advertising at kids wasn't really effective, because as it turns out, kids under 12 usually don't have a lot of money to spend. It was thought that targeting the parents of those children was the better route to go. Beyond that, the money that was spent on children's advertising was focused on television, which was the much more popular medium. Arbitron, the company at the time that was used for collecting demographic data on listeners for advertising, didn't even bother collecting data for listeners under 12. They were deemed unimportant, and so there was literally no information for the entire market that Radio AAHS was trying to monetize. And that made selling ad space on their network especially difficult. To add to those complications, CBC understood that they had a responsibility to maintain an ethical ad policy, considering their primary listeners were impressionable kids. That meant capping ads at 10 minutes every hour, turning down ads that were deemed too violent or mature, and limiting ads such as fast food or soda commercials. It created this persistent question as to whether the market was worth going after at all. Yet, Radio AAHS kept growing. Like many new companies, they had no expectations of being profitable right away. They believed that by committing years towards polishing and expanding their programming, the advertisers would eventually follow, and in the long term, children's radio would prove to be a viable market. CBC would eventually introduce a live musical event called Kids Stock, which would take place 4 times a year and attract crowds of up to 10,000. They would also introduce a publication called Radio AAHS Magazine, which ran about 80 pages and featured interviews, music and movie reviews, and a CD or cassette with that month's top songs from the station. In 1994, Radio Oz introduced 2 new weekly live shows that seemed like the perfect partnership considering their target audience. Every Saturday, listeners would get to tune into Disneyland Live, and every Sunday, listeners would get to hear radio personality Jammin' JoJo report live from Walt Disney World. By 1995, Radio Oz had grown and was broadcasting to enough affiliate stations across the country to reach 30% of America. Yet, they were still operating in the red. But there was hope that 1996 would be their first profitable year, and it would be thanks to a promising new partnership. That December, CBC began negotiating a partnership with ABC Radio. At that point, ABC Radio's network consisted of over 1,000 radio stations, and their advertising sales division accounted for nearly 40% of all radio ad spend in the country. This was exactly the kind of partner that CBC was looking for. They'd have the resources to help Radio Oz grow, and they'd have the industry experience to make it profitable. Under the partnership, CBC would pay ABC Radio $25,000 a month, and in return, ABC Radio would assist them with research, marketing, and promotional support. Additionally, they'd serve as Radio Oz's national ad sales representative, which would be a key factor in turning things around financially. And to top it all off, ABC Radio was in the process of being acquired, through their parent company ABC, by the Walt Disney Company. The Children's Broadcasting Corporation was about to start working with an industry titan, and that titan was about to be purchased by another kid-friendly company. It was perfect. As planned, the 2 organizations worked together to do more market research into ways to improve Radio Oz. That information, under the normal terms of the agreement, was considered confidential. More importantly, that information was contractually only supposed to be used for the purposes of the agreement. In other words, helping Radio Oz. It made sense too. Radio Oz was paying ABC Radio a lot of money for that kind of exclusivity. It would throw off the value of the deal completely if ABC Radio could just turn around and sell that data to a competitor. As it turned out, however, selling the data to a competitor would be the least of their worries. On July 25th, ABC Radio reached out to CBC and informed them that they were exercising their right to terminate their partnership. ABC Radio was their hopeful meal ticket to profitability, so investors were naturally worried. The announcement of the end of the deal hit CBC hard, knocking their stock price down from $7 a share to nearly $5. Just a few weeks later, ABC Radio and Disney announced that starting that fall, they'd be testing a new project in 4 markets across the country. It was a 24-hour radio network dedicated to children's programming called Radio Disney.
St. Paul, Radio Disney's on the air, the cool new station on AM 1440.
Radio Disney, we're all ears. Radio Disney.
Radio Disney first hit the airwaves on November 18, 1996. Their primary studio was located in Dallas, Texas, but they were broadcasting to test markets in Salt Lake City, Atlanta, Birmingham, and Minneapolis, which was also the home city of Radio Oz. The airwaves were populated with a blend of children's music as well as family-friendly pop music. A listener might hear A Whole New World one minute, only for it to be followed by the Macarena the next. Short news segments such as ABC News for Kids and ESPN Sports for Kids aimed to present real current events in a way that children could understand. At night, the station would switch over into what they described as an audio nightlight and would play lullabies and other soft sounds to help kids who might have trouble sleeping. The Children's Broadcasting Corporation, understandably unhappy, sued Disney. The initial lawsuit, filed at the U.S. District Court in Minneapolis, alleged that ABC Radio, serving as CBC's national ad rep and partner, used confidential information gained during their partnership to develop Radio Disney in an effort to take over the children's radio market. Members of CBC claim that ABC and Disney executives who visited and partook in meetings after the acquisition did so solely to gather as much information as they could before backing out of the partnership to work on Radio Disney. While the details weren't public at the time, which is often the case for a lawsuit, it was estimated that CBC was seeking upwards of $25 million in compensation. They were also seeking an injunction that would bar Disney from launching Radio Disney, but they were unsuccessful. Overnight, Radio Oz was in trouble. Not only had the partner that was supposed to finally bring them financial stability abandoned them, but they started their own competing children's radio station. To top it all off, that partner had just been purchased by the Walt Disney Company, an absolute unstoppable powerhouse when it came to children's entertainment. It was terrible. Radio Oz was backed into a corner. Sure, they sued, but lawsuits can take years and cost millions. In the meantime, there was nothing else they could do but try to compete with Disney. Radio Oz quickly pulled their 2 Disney park-based shows off the air and struck up a deal with Universal Studios that would allow them to air the same program from Universal Studios Hollywood and Universal Studios Orlando. CBC still struggled financially, but with Radio Disney just competing in 4 test markets, they were able to continue running Radio Oz into 1997. By that May, Disney announced that they were pleased with the response of their Radio Disney test, and that they would be moving forward with a national network. ABC radio networks accounted for over 2,800 radio stations nationwide by that point, and in some cases, local radio companies who owned ABC affiliates also owned Radio Oz affiliates. If push came to shove, who would they support? The relatively new startup that hadn't found financial footing yet? Or the industry titan that now had the backing of Disney? Furthermore, if you were a potential advertiser looking to spend money on children's content, where would you go? Radio Oz or the brand tied to Mickey Mouse? In June of 1997, CBC announced that they were planning to sell their 13 owned and operated radio stations. Radio Oz would still be produced and broadcast out to their 20 remaining affiliate stations, but they could no longer shoulder the financial burden of running their own. As expected, CBC blamed Disney's entry into the market for the situation. When Radio Disney was preparing to launch a station in LA, they promoted the event by sending 10,000 Mickey Mouse-shaped pencils, each with Radio Disney branding on it, to 18 different elementary schools in the area. They also went on to sponsor educational events across the country. Radio Disney was able to sway affiliates and win over new listeners, while Radio Oz struggled to find a buyer for their stations that they were selling just to stay afloat. It was a battle they felt they had to fight, but it was ultimately one they simply couldn't win. So in November of that year, CBC threw in the towel and announced that they would be ending Radio Oz. The program would formally end on January 30th, 1998. Though their story as a company doesn't end there. They planned to use the money from the station sales to pay off their debts before acquiring a company called Harmony Holdings Incorporated, which was a TV commercial production company that they already owned 42% of. In a somewhat poetic twist, they were exiting the world of radio to move into the world of producing advertising, the one thing they constantly struggled to get. In the fall of 1998, after Radio Oz had been defunct for 9 months, Children's Broadcasting Corporation finally got their day in court with Disney. In actuality, it was about 4.5 weeks in court, and after over 4 days of juror deliberation, the jury found that ABC Radio failed to perform under the strategic alliance they joined into, and improperly used confidential information to develop and launch Radio Disney. As it turned out, the estimated $25 million that CBC was rumored to be demanding was closer to $177 million, but the jury ultimately just awarded them $20 million. That following January, a federal court judge in St. Paul overturned the ruling, claiming that there ultimately wasn't enough evidence to prove that ABC Radio damaged CBC, and pointed out that CBC was already in financial trouble before the partnership had even begun. CBC, now partially counting on that payout to help move forward as a company, committed to appealing the ruling. By that spring, after over a year of failed attempts, CBC managed to sell their 13 owned and operated radio stations. As planned, they paid off their debts and used the remainder of the $66+ million to buy out Harmony Holdings Incorporated. In an effort to kick off the year 2000 with a fresh outlook, they renamed the merged company from the Children's Broadcasting Corporation to IntelliFilm, reflecting their shift away from children's radio and into commercial production. Radio Disney, on the other hand, was flourishing. The national network had grown to 50 affiliate stations across the country, more than Radio AAHS ever had. More importantly, their ratings those previous few years were boosted by the resurgence in popularity of teen pop music. Groups like the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, as well as singers like Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, meant that kids across the country were tuning into the station. And with many of those pop sensations getting their start at Disney with the Mickey Mouse Club, it made it even easier for Disney to work with them, hosting concerts at Disney's theme parks and arranging contests for listeners. In April of 2001, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals finally looked at IntelliFilm's lawsuit against Disney and decided to set aside the initial verdict. They decided to set a new trial that would focus solely on the monetary damages of the claims. Over a year later, the court once again sided with IntelliFilm, but this time lowered the amount awarded to them from $20 million down to $9.5 million. Disney, without any hesitation, filed motions to have that $9.5 million further reduced, arguing that they didn't cause that much damage to the company. Just as quickly as IntelliFilm had won for a second time, they found themselves having to fight for their winnings. That fight ended up costing them, and in June of 2002, IntelliFilm began to cut their workforce to help finance their continued lawsuit against Disney. SEC filings revealed that the company only had 11 employees at this point, so it was assumed by the public that the significant cut in workforce meant that IntelliFilm was reduced to nothing more than a shell company that was left around to finish the lawsuit. Luckily for IntelliFilm, that following fall would bring closure. They not only won the money they were awarded in the trial, but they were also awarded an additional $2.5 million in pre-judgment interest. Yet that same fall would bring more closure, as that's when they would finally file for bankruptcy. Over the following 2 years, they would use their winnings to pay off debts and liquidate, paying shareholders 32 cents per share. After an 8-year-long battle, IntelliFilm had finally won, and yet there was nothing left. Today, Radio Disney is still around and has moved on from the AM airwaves to become a multi-platform radio network. The station reaches over 3 million listeners every month through their app, website, and satellite radio. They've even started a second station dedicated to country music called Radio Disney Country. Entering their 24th year, Radio Disney has proven that there was indeed a market for dedicated children's programming. It was a point that the Children's Broadcasting Corporation set out to prove before being pulled into battle. Ultimately, Radio AAHS won that battle against Disney, but it was a Pyrrhic victory that cost them the war. Then again, many might argue that it was a war they never stood a chance of winning to begin with. And really, that's the brutal nature of the world of business. Sometimes fights aren't fair, and sometimes foes play dirty. Radio Disney's legacy was built upon such a battle, and like many battles before it, it might find itself lost to history.